My name is Dante Volkov, and I'm a mechanic who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak in Atlanta. 3 days ago, I was fixing cars in a hospital parking garage when the power died and the water turned people into monsters. I watched doctors become killers, patients hunt in packs, and the military abandon an entire city. I'm recording this because someone needs to know what really happened when civilization collapsed in less than 3 days. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. If you're watching this, it means you survived too. My name is Dante Volkov, and I'm a mechanic who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak in Atlanta. I'm recording this because someone needs to know what really happened when our world ended. Someone needs to understand how fast everything can fall apart. 3 days ago, I was just another guy trying to make an honest living. I ran a small, automotive repair business, mostly working on older cars that people couldn't afford to replace. That Tuesday night, I was in the parking garage underneath Metro General Hospital, bent over the hood of Mrs. Chen's 1998 Honda Civic. The engine wouldn't turn over, and she needed it fixed by morning for her commute to work. I remember thinking how quiet the garage was for a Tuesday night. Usually there would be more activity, more people coming and going from the hospital. But that night felt different. The air tasted metallic like copper pennies, and there were way too many ambulances for a regular weeknight. I counted at least 6 parked outside the emergency entrance when I'd arrived, and I could hear more sirens in the distance. Mrs. Chen had been worried about her car for weeks. She'd mentioned strange noises, the engine hesitating when she tried to start it. Classic symptoms of a failing starter motor. I'd promised to take a look after my regular shift, which is why I was there so late. The hospital parking garage was well lit and secure, plus Mrs. Chen had offered to pay me double my usual rate if I could fix it that night. As I worked on the Honda, I noticed something odd. The emergency room seemed unusually crowded through the glass doors. I could see people packed into the waiting area, more than I'd ever seen before. Families huddled together, some people coughing, others looking pale and sweaty under the fluorescent lights. I figured maybe there was a flu outbreak or something, seasonal, making the rounds. My grandfather used to say that when the lights go out, you find out who people really are. I thought he meant crime and looting. I had no idea how right he was about everything else. It was around 9:30 when the lights went out. Not just the parking garage lights, but everything. The whole hospital. The street lights outside, even the distant glow of downtown Atlanta just vanished. 1 second I was using my work light to see inside the Honda's engine compartment, and the next second, the entire city was plunged into complete darkness. At first I thought it was just a local power outage. Maybe a transformer had blown or someone had crashed into a power pole. I'd seen worse blackouts in Detroit where I grew up, but this felt different. This was too complete, too sudden. The darkness was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. I grabbed my flashlight from my toolbox and looked around. The emergency lighting in the hospital should have kicked in immediately, but nothing happened. No backup generators, humming to life. No battery-powered exit signs glowing in the dark. Just complete, absolute silence and darkness. That's when I started hearing the car alarms. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens of them going off simultaneously across the city. The sound echoed off the parking garage walls, creating this weird symphony of electronic panic. But even stranger was how the alarms started dying out one by one as their batteries drained. Within 20 minutes, the city was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I decided to check on the hospital. Places like Metro General always had backup power systems, multiple generators, fuel reserves. If anywhere was going to have lights and working equipment, it would be there. Plus, I figured they might need someone who understood electrical systems to help get their generators running. I packed up my tools, locked Mrs. Chen's Honda, and headed toward the hospital entrance. The darkness was so complete that I had to use my flashlight just to find the doors. When I pushed through the emergency room entrance, the smell hit me first. It wasn't the usual hospital smell of disinfectant and antiseptic. This was something else, something organic and wrong. The air was thick and humid, carrying a metallic scent that reminded me of old blood mixed with something rotting. I'd worked in enough auto shops to know what different fluids smelled like, but this was unlike anything I'd encountered. The emergency room was packed with people, way more than what I'd seen from outside. Families sat on the floor, holding dying cell phones like prayer candles. Some people were coughing, deep, wet coughs that echoed off the walls. Others just sat there in the dim glow of emergency lighting that had finally flickered to life, staring at nothing with glazed eyes. I found a nurse near the reception desk and asked if they needed help with their electrical systems. She looked exhausted, her scrubs stained with something dark that I couldn't identify in the poor lighting. She pointed me toward the maintenance office and said they'd lost their main generator about an hour before the blackout. Walking through the hospital corridors was like moving through a nightmare. The emergency lighting cast these weird shadows that made everything look distorted. People were lying on gurneys in the hallways, some moaning softly, others completely still. The weird thing wasn't how many people were sick. It was how they all looked the same kind of sick. Their skin had this grayish pallor, and their eyes looked different. Not just tired or feverish, but actually different. The whites of their eyes had this yellowish tint, and their pupils seemed larger than normal. Some of them had what looked like dark veins showing through their skin, particularly around their necks and temples. I found Dr. Martinez in the maintenance corridor near the generator room. I'd met her before when I'd brought in a guy who'd been crushed by a car engine at my shop. She was a good doctor, always calm under pressure, but that night she looked scared, really scared. She recognized me immediately and grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, almost desperate. She said they needed someone who knew electrical systems because their main generator had failed, and they were running on backup power that wouldn't last much longer. I asked her what had happened to all the people in the emergency room. She looked around nervously before answering, like she was afraid someone might overhear us. She said it was water contamination, started that morning. People had been drinking from the tap and getting sick within hours. Fever, delirium, and then they got violent, really violent. She kept checking her watch like she was timing something. Later I realized she was timing how fast people were changing. She said the symptoms followed a pattern. First came the fever and the disorientation, then the physical changes, the grayish skin and the dark veins. Finally, the aggression. But it wasn't normal aggression, she explained. These people weren't just angry or confused. They were attacking anyone who came near them with a single-minded intensity that she'd never seen before. Security had to restrain several patients who had tried to bite nurses and doctors. She mentioned something that stuck with me. She said the patients weren't just dying from this thing. They were becoming something else entirely. Their vital signs would drop to almost nothing, but they'd still be moving, still be aware. Their body temperature would plummet, but they'd still be active, still be aggressive. I asked her if she'd contacted the CDC or the state health department. She said they'd tried, but all communications had been cut when the power went out. No landlines, no cell towers, no internet. They were completely isolated with no way to call for help or get guidance on how to handle the situation. That's when we heard the screaming from upstairs. Not the normal sounds of a busy hospital, but something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was coming from the upper floors, echoing down through the stairwells. Dr. Martinez looked at me with fear in her eyes and said we needed to check on the psychiatric ward. She'd received reports of disturbances up there, but with the power out and the elevators not working, no one had been able to get up there to investigate. We climbed the dark stairwell using our flashlights to navigate. The screaming got louder as we went higher. By the time we reached the 4th floor, it was almost deafening. But it wasn't just screaming. There were other sounds too. Banging, like someone was hitting the walls with tremendous force. And underneath it all, this weird growling noise that didn't sound human. The psychiatric ward had reinforced doors with small windows made of thick safety glass. Dr. Martinez approached the first door cautiously and peered through the window. I watched her face go completely white. She stepped back and motioned for me to look. What I saw through that window changed everything. The patient inside wasn't a patient anymore. He was throwing himself against the door over and over with incredible force. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by someone who didn't know how bodies were supposed to move. But his eyes were the worst part. They were completely black, like they'd been filled with ink. No whites, no iris, just solid black. And they were focused on us with an intensity that was absolutely terrifying. When he saw me looking through the window, he stopped throwing himself against the door and just stared at me. Then he opened his mouth and let out this sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a growl. Dr. Martinez pulled me away from the window and said we needed to get back downstairs immediately. But as we moved down the corridor, I could see through the other windows. Every room was the same. Patients and staff alike, all with those black eyes, all moving with that same unnatural, jerky motion. The security doors at the end of the corridor were barricaded with gurneys and chairs. Through the reinforced glass, I could see more of them. They were throwing themselves against the barriers, working together in a way that seemed almost coordinated. They weren't just random acts of violence. There was purpose behind their actions. Dr. Martinez said something that terrified me more than anything I'd seen. She said they were getting smarter. At first, she thought she meant they were learning. But as I watched them through the glass, I realized she meant something else entirely. They were evolving. One of them had figured out how to manipulate the door handle. It wasn't just pulling or pushing randomly. It was actually trying to turn the handle in the correct direction. Another one had picked up a medical instrument and was using it to try to pry open a gap in the barricade. These weren't just sick people anymore. Whatever had been in the water had changed them into something else, something that retained enough intelligence to problem solve, but had lost everything that made them human. We hurried back down to the main floor, but the situation there had deteriorated rapidly. More patients were showing symptoms, and the staff was struggling to maintain control. Several people had to be physically restrained after attacking other patients or trying to bite medical personnel. Dr. Martinez said security was implementing a lockdown protocol. All exits were being sealed and no one was allowed to leave the building until they could figure out what was happening. She said it was for everyone's safety, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't sure they could contain whatever was spreading through the hospital. I spent the next few hours trying to get the main generator working, but the damage was too extensive. Someone would need to order replacement parts, assuming we could even contact suppliers. The backup generator was holding, but it was only designed to run for about 24 hours before needing refueling. As I worked, I could hear the situation getting worse throughout the hospital. More screaming, more sounds of violence, more calls for security over the intercom system. The staff was clearly overwhelmed and struggling to maintain order. Around 3 a.m, I was in the electrical room when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Slow, shuffling footsteps that didn't sound right. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I waited in the darkness, barely breathing. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps moved away. I turned my flashlight back on and continued working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me through the door. By dawn, the situation had become critical. The psychiatric ward's security doors were showing signs of stress from the constant battering. Dr. Martinez reported that several more patients throughout the hospital were showing symptoms. The infection, or whatever it was spreading faster than they could contain it. I was finishing up with the generator when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. It was the sound of reinforced steel beginning to buckle under pressure. The security doors on the psychiatric ward were failing. Dr. Martinez's voice came over the intercom, urgent and scared. She said everyone needed to evacuate the 4th floor immediately. Security was requesting all available personnel to assist with emergency containment procedures, but I knew it was too late for containment. Whatever was happening in that psychiatric ward was about to spread throughout the entire hospital, and I was trapped in the middle of it with nowhere to run. The patient didn't just bite the nurse who tried to help him. He tore at her like he was trying to get inside her skin. The security guard who responded didn't fare any better. These things weren't just violent. They were predatory in a way that human beings simply weren't designed to be. That's when I learned the most important rule of survival in this new world. When someone you know stops being human, you don't hesitate. You don't try to reason with them or help them or save them. You run, because the alternative is becoming just like them. And that's exactly what I was about to find out as the security doors finally gave way, and the first of those black-eyed things stepped into the corridor, looking directly at me with hunger in its eyes. The security door burst open with a sound like thunder, and the first infected person stumbled into the corridor. It had been a nurse once, I could tell from the scrubs, but now its eyes were solid black pools and its skin had that grayish pallor I'd noticed in the emergency room. It moved wrong, like its joints weren't quite connected properly, but it moved with purpose toward the nearest person it could see. That person was me. I didn't think. I just ran. Down the corridor, past the elevator banks, toward the stairwell. Behind me, I could hear more of them pouring through the broken security door. Their footsteps were uneven but relentless, like they never got tired or needed to rest. I made it to the stairwell and started descending as fast as I could without falling. But I could hear them following me, their shuffling gait echoing in the concrete shaft. What scared me most was how they seemed to know exactly where I was going. They weren't just wandering randomly, they were hunting. I reached the second floor and ducked into the maintenance corridor I'd been working in earlier. There was a small room filled with electrical panels and circuit breakers where I could hide and figure out what to do next. I locked the door behind me and tried to catch my breath. That's when Dr. Martinez's voice came over the hospital intercom system. The backup power was still working, so the communication system was functional. She said all staff and visitors needed to find secure locations immediately. The situation on the 4th floor was spreading to other areas of the hospital. She said they were getting smarter. At first, I thought she meant they were learning. I didn't realize she meant evolving. Her voice was strained, like she was trying to stay calm while dealing with something beyond her understanding. She mentioned that security teams were being overwhelmed and that standard containment procedures weren't working. I took inventory of what I had with me. My toolbox, which contained various wrenches, screwdrivers, and a small crowbar. My flashlight with about half battery life remaining. A bottle of water and an energy bar I'd brought for my late-night work session. Not much to survive on, but it would have to do. From my hiding spot, I could hear them moving through the hospital corridors. Their footsteps had a rhythm to them, like they were patrolling in groups. Sometimes I'd hear other sounds too. Doors opening and closing, things being moved around, almost like they were searching methodically room by room. I kept thinking about my truck down in the parking garage. 5 floors down, through God knows how many of those things. The truck had supplies, more tools, a CB radio that might still work even if the cell towers were down. But getting there seemed impossible with the hospital crawling with infected people. Dr. Martinez came back on the intercom about an hour later. She said she'd managed to secure the pediatric ward on the 3rd floor with a small group of survivors. The children's hospital had better security doors and more isolated access points. She was trying to coordinate with other survivor groups throughout the building. That's when I learned I wasn't the only one who had managed to find a hiding place. There were voices responding over the intercom from different floors, a security guard holed up in the main office, some kitchen staff barricaded in the cafeteria, a few doctors who had secured themselves in an operating room. But what struck me was how Dr. Martinez described the infected people's behavior. She said they were getting more coordinated with each passing hour. They'd figured out how to open doors that weren't locked. Some of them had started using objects as tools, like using chairs to smash through windows or medical equipment to break down barriers. She said something that chilled me to the bone. The basement levels were quiet, too quiet. Even the infected seemed to avoid going down there. No one knew why, but every time someone tried to reach the lower levels, they reported strange sounds coming from below, sounds that didn't match what we'd been hearing from the infected on the upper floors. I decided to test my theory about their intelligence. I opened the door to my hiding room just a crack and threw one of my screwdrivers down the corridor. It clattered against the far wall and immediately I heard movement. Multiple sets of footsteps converging on the sound from different directions. But here's what scared me. They didn't all rush toward the noise like mindless animals would. Some of them went toward the sound, but others spread out to cover the surrounding area, like they knew the noise might be a distraction, and they were positioning themselves to catch whatever had made it. I closed the door quietly and waited. Within 5 minutes, I could hear them outside my door, not banging on it or trying to break it down, but testing the handle, listening for sounds from inside. One of them actually pressed its face against the door, and I could see its black eye through the small gap under the doorframe. They knew I was in there, but they were being patient, waiting for me to make a mistake or show myself. This wasn't the behavior of mindless infected people. This was predatory intelligence. Dr. Martinez's voice came over the intercom again, but this time she sounded more frightened. She said the infected on her floor were working together to break through the pediatric ward's security measures. They were using medical equipment in ways that showed clear problem-solving abilities. She mentioned something else that made my blood run cold. She said some of the infected people seemed to be communicating with each other, not with words, but with gestures and sounds that other infected individuals appeared to understand. They were developing their own language. I realized I needed to move before they figured out how to get into my hiding spot. The hospital had an extensive network of maintenance tunnels and service corridors that most people didn't know about. As someone who had worked on the building's electrical systems, I knew these passages better than almost anyone. I waited until I heard them move away from my door, probably following some other sound or distraction. Then I opened a maintenance panel in the back wall of the room that led to the building's utility tunnels. These passages ran between floors and connected to various mechanical rooms throughout the hospital. The tunnels were pitch black and barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, but they offered a way to move through the building without using the main corridors. I grabbed my essential tools and started navigating through the maze of pipes and electrical conduits. As I crawled through the tunnels, I could hear the infected people moving through the hospital above me. Their footsteps had become more organized, more coordinated. It sounded like they were conducting systematic searches of each floor, room by room. But what really scared me was when I heard one of them in the tunnel system with me. I don't know how it had found the entrance, but I could hear it crawling through the passages maybe 50 feet behind me. It moved differently than a normal person would, with this jerky, unnatural rhythm that sent chills down my spine. I reached a junction where the tunnel split in 3 directions. One led toward the cafeteria where the kitchen staff had barricaded themselves. Another led toward the main elevator shaft. The third led down toward the basement levels that Dr. Martinez had said were mysteriously quiet. I chose the elevator shaft route, thinking I could use the maintenance ladder to descend toward the parking garage. But when I reached the shaft, I discovered the elevator car was stuck between the 2nd and 3rd floors, blocking my path downward. That's when I heard Dr. Martinez screaming over the intercom. Not just fear, but pure terror. She was shouting warnings about the infected people breaking through their defenses. But her last words before the intercom cut to static were what haunted me. She screamed something about the smart ones, about how they were different from the others. I didn't understand what she meant until I encountered one myself. I was trying to find an alternate route through the tunnel system when I came face to face with one of the infected in a maintenance corridor. But this one was different from the others I'd seen. It had been a doctor once. I could tell from the white coat it still wore. But unlike the others, its movements weren't jerky or unnatural. It moved with deliberate precision, like it was thinking about each action before taking it. Its black eyes weren't vacant like the others. They showed intelligence, awareness, calculation. When it saw me, it didn't immediately attack. It studied me, tilting its head like it was analyzing a problem. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound that wasn't quite human, but wasn't the growling I'd heard from the others either. It was almost like it was trying to communicate. But the most terrifying thing was what happened next. It reached into its coat pocket and pulled out a scalpel, not to attack me with it immediately, but to examine it, turning it over in its hands like it was remembering how to use medical instruments. I backed away slowly, and it followed me with that same deliberate, calculating movement. It wasn't driven by hunger or rage like the others. This thing was hunting me with intelligence and patience. It was planning its attack. I managed to get back into the tunnel system before it could reach me, but I knew I'd encountered something far more dangerous than the regular infected people. These smart ones, as Dr. Martinez had called them, retained enough of their human intelligence to be truly terrifying predators. As I crawled through the tunnels, I started hearing more sounds from throughout the hospital. Not just the shuffling and growling of the infected, but construction sounds. Banging, scraping, things being moved and arranged. It sounded like they were building something. I found a ventilation grate that looked down into one of the patient rooms and carefully peered through it. What I saw defied everything I thought. I knew about these infected people. They were rearranging the furniture, stacking beds and chairs in specific patterns. It wasn't random destruction. They were creating structures, almost like nests or defensive positions. And they were working together with a level of coordination that suggested they had some kind of hierarchy or command structure. The regular infected ones were doing the heavy lifting, moving furniture and debris. But there were others, the smart, ones like the doctor I'd encountered, who seemed to be directing the activities. Dr. Martinez had been right. They weren't just getting smarter. They were evolving into something entirely new, something that combined human intelligence with predatory instincts and pack behavior. I continued through the tunnel system, trying to find a route that would get me closer to the parking garage. But every path I tried seemed to be blocked or monitored by the infected. They were learning the building's layout just as well as I knew it, maybe better. That's when I heard something that made me stop completely. Voices. Human voices coming from one of the patient rooms below me. I thought maybe there were other survivors, people who had managed to avoid infection. But as I listened more carefully, I realized these weren't survivors. These were infected people, but they were talking. Not the grunts and growls I'd heard before, but actual words. Broken and distorted but recognizable speech. They were discussing strategy, planning how to search different areas of the hospital, coordinating their hunting patterns to be more effective. The smart ones were teaching, the others sharing information and tactics. I realized that everything I thought I knew about surviving this situation was wrong. These weren't just infected people I needed to avoid. They were becoming something else entirely, something that could think, plan, and adapt faster than I could. And they were hunting me specifically. I could hear them talking about the maintenance, tunnels, about someone moving through the building's hidden passages. They knew I was there, and they were working together to find me. The infected person behind me in the tunnel system was getting closer. I could hear it navigating the passages with increasing confidence, like it was learning the layout as it moved. Soon it would catch up to me and I'd be trapped between it and whatever was waiting at the other end of the tunnel. I reached another junction and had to make a decision. I could try to reach the cafeteria where the kitchen staff might still be alive, but that would mean exposing myself in the main corridors. I could attempt to get to the parking garage, but that meant going down to those mysteriously quiet basement levels. Or I could try to reach Dr. Martinez's position in the pediatric ward, assuming she was still alive after what I'd heard over the intercom. None of the options seemed good, but staying in the tunnels meant eventually being caught by the infected person following me. I had to take action before they completely surrounded me. I chose the basement route, partly because of my curiosity about why even the infected seemed to avoid going down there. Maybe there was something in the lower levels that could help me understand what was happening, or maybe there was a safer way to reach the parking garage. As I made my way toward the basement access tunnel, I could hear the infected people above me becoming more active. Their voices were getting louder and more organized. It sounded like they were preparing for some kind of coordinated search of the entire building. But I also started hearing those strange sounds Dr. Martinez had mentioned, coming from deep below the hospital, sounds that didn't match anything I'd heard from the infected people. Deep, resonant noises that seemed to vibrate through the building structure itself. Whatever was down in the basement levels, it wasn't the same as what I'd been dealing with on the upper floors. And as I descended deeper into the hospital's foundation, I began to suspect that the infected people weren't the only things that had changed in the last 3 days. The air was getting thicker as I went deeper, and that metallic smell I'd noticed when I first entered the hospital was becoming stronger. Much stronger. Like the source of whatever had contaminated the water supply was somewhere below me. And then I realized something that made my heart race with terror. The infected person following me through the tunnels had stopped. It wasn't pursuing me anymore. Just like Dr. Martinez had said, even the infected seemed to avoid the basement levels. That meant whatever was down there was something even they were afraid of. The descent into the basement levels was like entering a completely different world. The emergency lighting that had been barely functional on the upper floors was completely dead down here. My flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness, only illuminating a few feet in front of me at a time. The air was thick and humid, carrying that metallic smell I'd noticed earlier, but now it was so strong it made my eyes water. There was something else mixed in with it too, something organic and rotten that reminded me of meat left out in the sun for too long. I emerged from the maintenance tunnel into what looked like a service corridor. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. But there was another sound too, something I couldn't quite identify. A low humming that seemed to come from the building itself. The basement level was much larger than I'd expected. Metro General was an old hospital, built in the 1950s, and the foundation extended far beyond what you'd guess from looking at the building from street level. There were storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and corridors that seemed to go on forever into the darkness. In the dark, you could hear them better. And what I heard scared me more than what I'd seen. The infected people on the floors above me were moving with increasing coordination. I could hear their footsteps through the ceiling, marching in formation, like some kind of military unit. But they weren't coming down here. Something was keeping them away from the basement levels. I found a supply room filled with medical equipment and decided to take stock of what was available. There were boxes of surgical supplies, medications, and emergency equipment that might be useful. But more importantly, there were cases of bottled water and some emergency food rations. As I searched through the supplies, I found something that made me pause. There were several boxes labeled with dates from 3 weeks ago, medical supplies that had been delivered well before the outbreak started. But these weren't normal medical supplies. These were research materials, laboratory equipment, things that seemed out of place in a regular hospital. I opened one of the boxes and found vials of liquid, testing equipment, and documentation that I couldn't fully understand. But what I could read made my blood run cold. References to water treatment facilities, population distribution studies, and something called Protocol 7 that kept appearing in the paperwork. The documents were stamped with military classifications and government seals. This wasn't medical research. This was something else entirely. Something that had been planned and prepared for weeks before anyone in Atlanta started getting sick. I stuffed some of the documents into my toolbox and continued exploring the basement. The corridor led to a larger room that housed the hospital's main water treatment and filtration systems. This was where all the incoming water was processed before being distributed throughout the building. The treatment system had been modified. I could tell because some of the equipment wasn't standard for a hospital water system. There were additional tanks, injection systems, and monitoring equipment that looked like it had been installed recently. The metallic smell was strongest here, coming directly from the water treatment tanks. These people hadn't been bitten. They'd been torn apart, like something bigger had gotten to them. The bodies I found near the water treatment system showed signs of violence that didn't match what I'd seen from the infected people upstairs. These wounds were different, more savage, like they'd been made by something with much larger teeth and claws. There were 3 bodies total, all wearing maintenance uniforms. They'd been killed while working on the water system, probably trying to shut down whatever had been added to the water supply. But they'd been stopped by something that was much more dangerous than the infected people I'd been avoiding. I examined the water treatment system more carefully and found evidence of tampering. Someone had deliberately introduced something into the hospital's water supply. But this wasn't random sabotage. This was precise, calculated, designed to achieve a specific result. The injection system was still active, still pumping whatever had been added to the water into the hospital's supply lines. I tried to shut it down, but the controls required access codes that I didn't have. Someone had locked the system to prevent exactly what I was trying to do, but I found something else that was even more disturbing. A monitoring system that was tracking the progression of the infection throughout the hospital. Real-time data showing how many people had been affected, what symptoms they were displaying, and how quickly the infection was spreading. This wasn't an accident or a natural outbreak. This was a deliberate experiment, and everyone in the hospital was a test subject. The infected people upstairs weren't victims. They were the intended result of whatever had been put in the water supply. The Documents I'd found earlier started to make more sense. Protocol 7 wasn't a containment procedure. It was the code name for this entire operation. The military had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. They'd chosen Metro General as a testing ground because it was isolated enough to contain the results but large enough to provide meaningful data. I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me and quickly turned off my flashlight. But these footsteps sounded different from the infected people upstairs. Heavier, more deliberate, with a rhythm that suggested someone in boots rather than hospital, shoes or bare feet. I hid behind one of the water treatment tanks and waited. The footsteps came closer, accompanied by the sound of equipment being moved. Someone was conducting a systematic search of the basement level, checking each room methodically. A beam of light swept across the room, much brighter than my flashlight. Military-grade equipment. I pressed myself against the tank and tried to stay perfectly still. The light passed over my hiding spot twice, but whoever was carrying it didn't seem to notice me. I heard a voice speaking into a radio, military terminology, reporting on the status of the water treatment system and the condition of the bodies they'd found. They were conducting damage assessment, trying to determine if their experiment had been compromised. The voice mentioned something about secondary mutations. Apparently the infection wasn't producing uniform results. Some subjects were developing differently than others, showing enhanced intelligence or physical capabilities that weren't part of the original design. That explained the smart ones I'd encountered. They weren't just random variations in the infection. They were evolutionary adaptations, the infection improving itself based on the host's capabilities. The smarter the original person, the more dangerous they became after infection. The military personnel moved on to another room, but I could still hear them conducting their search. They were looking for survivors, but not to rescue them. They were collecting data, documenting the results of their experiment before implementing the next phase of Protocol 7. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then made my way deeper into the basement. There had to be another way out, some kind of service entrance or emergency exit that would let me reach the parking garage without going back through the infected areas upstairs. I found a corridor that led toward the hospital's loading dock area. This was where supplies were delivered and where the building's major mechanical systems were housed. The corridor was longer than I'd expected, extending well beyond what I thought was the hospital's footprint. As I walked, I started hearing those strange sounds Dr. Martinez had mentioned. Deep, resonant noises that seemed to come from even further below. They weren't mechanical sounds. They were organic, like breathing, but much louder and deeper than any human could produce. The corridor opened into a large mechanical room that housed the hospital's main generators and heating systems. But there were modifications here too, equipment that didn't belong in a hospital's infrastructure, research apparatus, monitoring systems, and containment units that suggested this space was being used for something other than building maintenance. I found a set of stairs leading down to an even lower level. The sounds were coming from down there, along with air currents that carried a smell unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not the metallic water contamination smell, but something else. Something alive. Every instinct told me not to go down those stairs, but I needed to understand what was happening. The military documents had mentioned secondary mutations, and I was beginning to suspect that the infected people upstairs weren't the only results of this experiment. The lower level was carved directly out of the bedrock beneath the hospital. This wasn't part of the original building. It had been excavated specifically for this project, probably months or years before the outbreak began. The walls were lined with reinforced concrete and metal, like a bunker or research facility. There were holding cells down there, empty now, but recently used. The smell of disinfectant couldn't completely mask the odors of confinement and fear. Someone had been keeping test subjects down here, studying them, documenting their transformation. But some of the cells had been torn open from the inside. Whatever had been contained here was stronger than the builders had anticipated. The metal bars were bent outward, and the concrete wall showed scratch marks that looked like they'd been made by claws. I found a research station with computers and monitoring equipment. Most of it had been destroyed, but I managed to find some files on a backup drive. Research data showing the progression of the infection in controlled subjects. Video recordings of the transformation process. documentation of failed attempts to control or reverse the changes. The experiments had started with volunteer subjects, people who had agreed to participate in medical research. But as the infection progressed, the subjects became increasingly aggressive and difficult to control. The researchers had been forced to move to larger containment units and stronger security measures. But even those hadn't been enough. The most recent entries in the research log described subjects that had developed far beyond what anyone had expected. Enhanced strength, improved sensory capabilities, and most disturbing of all, collective intelligence. The infected subjects were communicating with each other and coordinating their actions. That's when I realized what those sounds were. The deep breathing, the resonant noises that seemed to come from the very foundation of the building. There were still test subjects down here, but they'd escaped from their containment cells. They were living in the deepest parts of the basement, and they were much more dangerous than the infected people upstairs. The research data showed that these basement subjects had been exposed to higher concentrations of whatever was in the water supply. They'd undergone more complete transformations, developing capabilities that made them apex predators. They were stronger, faster, and smarter than the regular infected people, but they were also more territorial. They'd claimed the basement levels as their domain, and were preventing the regular infected from coming down here. That's why even the smart ones from the upper floors avoided the basement. They instinctively knew there was something down here that could destroy them. I found a map of the facility that showed access tunnels leading to various parts of the city. The basement complex was much larger than just the hospital. It connected to the city's storm drain system, the subway tunnels, and several other buildings in the downtown area. This wasn't just an experiment on the hospital's population. It was a test run for something much larger. The tunnels would allow infected subjects to spread throughout the city without being detected. The water supply contamination was just the beginning. I was studying the map when I heard movement in the corridor behind me. Not the footsteps of military personnel or the shuffling of regular infected people. This was something else. Something large moving through the darkness with predatory stealth. I turned off my flashlight and tried to find a hiding place, but the research area was too open. There was nowhere to conceal myself from something that was actively hunting me. I could hear it getting closer, moving with the patience of a predator that knew its prey was trapped. The breathing sounds I'd been hearing were getting louder, and I realized they were coming from whatever was stalking me. These weren't just enhanced infected people. They were something else entirely, something that had evolved far beyond human recognition. I grabbed the research files and started backing toward what I hoped was another exit. But the map had shown that this level only had limited access points, and most of them led deeper into the tunnel system rather than back toward the surface. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of my flashlight beam, a shape that was roughly human but wrong in every possible way. It was larger than a person, with elongated limbs and a posture that suggested it was equally comfortable moving on, 2 legs or 4. Its skin had a wet, almost translucent quality that reflected the light in disturbing ways. But its eyes were the worst part. Not the solid black of the regular infected people, but something that seemed to contain intelligence and malice in equal measure. It was studying me the same way I might study a broken engine, analyzing the problem and determining the best way to take me apart. It didn't attack immediately. Instead, it circled around me, always staying just at the edge of the light. Testing my reactions, learning my limitations, planning its approach. This thing retained enough human intelligence to be strategic, but it had gained predatory instincts that made it far more dangerous than any human could be. I realized that the regular infected people upstairs were just the first stage of whatever this infection was designed to do. These basement subjects were the intended final result, enhanced humans with predatory capabilities, perfect for whatever the military had planned for the next phase of Protocol 7. The creature made a sound that was part growl and part something else, almost like it was trying to communicate, but in a language that human vocal cords weren't designed to produce. It was answered by similar sounds from other parts of the basement complex. There were more of them down here, an entire pack of these enhanced predators living in the tunnels, beneath the city, and they were communicating with each other, coordinating their hunt just like the smart infected people upstairs, but with far greater sophistication. I started moving toward what the map showed as a service tunnel leading toward the parking structure, but the creature paralleled my movement. It wasn't trying to catch me immediately. It was herding me, driving me toward its packmates who were probably positioned at the exits. The research files I'd found mentioned that these enhanced subjects showed pack hunting behavior similar to wolves or other apex predators. They would work together to isolate prey, and then attack in coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm any defense. As I reached the service tunnel, I could hear more of them moving through the darkness. The sounds were coming from multiple directions, suggesting they'd completely surrounded the research area. They were patient, intelligent, and working together with a level of coordination that made them nearly impossible to evade. I had a choice to make. I could try to fight my way through them, but I was just one person with basic tools against multiple enhanced predators. I could try to find a hiding place and wait for them to lose interest, but they'd already detected me and seemed to be actively hunting. Or I could try to use my knowledge of the building's infrastructure to find an escape route they hadn't anticipated. The basement complex was extensive, but it was still a human-built structure. There had to be maintenance access points, emergency systems, or structural weaknesses that I could exploit. I chose the third option, but I knew I was running out of time. The creatures were getting bolder, moving closer to my position. Soon they would decide that their analysis was complete and launch their coordinated attack. And when that happened, I would discover just how much more dangerous these enhanced infected had become compared to the regular ones I'd been avoiding upstairs. The breathing sounds were all around me now, and I could see multiple pairs of those. Intelligent, malevolent eyes reflecting my flashlight beam from the darkness. They were ready to strike, and I was about to learn whether my human intelligence and mechanical knowledge would be enough to survive against predators that combined human reasoning with enhanced physical capabilities. The enhanced infected struck without warning, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. I threw myself sideways into the service tunnel just as claws raked through the air where my head had been a split second before. The sound they made against the concrete wall was like metal scraping against stone. I ran through the tunnel with my flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me, illuminating glimpses of pipes and electrical conduits. Behind me, I could hear them pursuing with that same unnatural speed. But they weren't just chasing randomly. They were setting traps, actual traps, using medical equipment to block my escape routes. I reached a junction where the tunnel split into 3 directions and chose the path that led toward the parking structure according to the map I'd memorized. But when I got there, I found surgical tables stacked across the passage, blocking my way completely. They'd anticipated my route and prepared for it. These things weren't just enhanced physically. They retained enough human intelligence to think strategically, to plan ahead, to coordinate complex actions. But they'd also gained predatory instincts that made them more dangerous than any human had ever been. I backtracked and tried the second tunnel, but that one was blocked too. They'd used wheelchairs and IV stands to create a barrier that would take time to dismantle, time I didn't have with them closing in behind me. They were forcing me toward the third tunnel, herding me like livestock toward whatever trap they'd prepared. I had no choice but to take the third route, but I went cautiously, knowing it was probably exactly where they wanted me to go. The tunnel led deeper into the basement complex, away from the parking structure and toward areas that weren't on any of the building plans I'd seen. As I moved through the darkness, I started hearing explosions in the distance. Big ones. The kind that meant the military wasn't just containing anymore. They were implementing whatever the next phase of Protocol 7 involved, and it sounded like it included demolition. The explosions were getting closer, shaking dust from the tunnel ceiling with each blast. Whatever the military had planned, they were systematically destroying evidence of their experiment, starting from the outside and working their way toward the hospital itself. That's when I realized what was really happening. Protocol 7 wasn't just about testing the infection. It was about covering up the testing afterward. They were going to destroy the entire area and blame it on some kind of natural disaster or terrorist attack. Everyone who had been exposed to their experiment was going to be eliminated, including any survivors who might be able to tell the truth about what had happened. I found another research station in a side chamber off the main tunnel. This one had been abandoned more recently, with computers still running and data files open on the screens. The researchers had been monitoring the enhanced subjects in real time, tracking their development and behavior patterns. The data showed that the enhanced infected were evolving even faster than anyone had predicted. They'd developed their own social structure, with clear hierarchies and specialized roles. Some were hunters, others were builders, and a few showed signs of what the researchers called strategic intelligence. But the most disturbing entry in the research log was dated just hours before the power had gone out. The enhanced subjects had somehow learned to manipulate the facility's security systems. They'd figured out how to open electronic locks, disable monitoring equipment, and even access the computer networks. They weren't just escaping from their containment. They were taking control of the facility itself. The researchers had lost the ability to monitor or control them, which explained why the military was now implementing total destruction protocols. I heard movement in the tunnel behind me and quickly downloaded as much data as I could onto a portable drive I found at the research station. If I survived this, someone needed to know what had really happened here. The truth about Protocol 7 and the military's role in creating these monsters. The enhanced infected had found me again, but this time they approached differently. Instead of immediate attack, they seemed to be studying the research equipment almost like they recognized it from their time as test subjects. One of them operated a computer terminal with surprising dexterity, accessing files and reviewing data. They remembered being human. They remembered being experimented on, and they were angry about it. Not the mindless rage of the regular infected people, but calculated, intelligent fury. They wanted revenge against the people who had done this to them, and they saw me as connected to their tormentors. I looked at me like it knew me, like it remembered being human and hated me for still being one. The enhanced infected that seemed to be their leader was examining the research data I'd been looking at. It understood what it was seeing, recognized its own transformation process in the scientific documentation. It turned to look at me, and I saw something in its eyes that was almost worse than mindless hunger. I saw awareness. It knew what had been done to it, knew what it had become, and it blamed every human it encountered for its condition. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking me immediately, it started manipulating the computer system. Within minutes, it had accessed the facility's communication network and was sending signals to other enhanced subjects throughout the complex. They were coordinating a response to the military's demolition efforts. These creatures weren't just trying to survive or hunt. They were actively fighting back against the people who had created them. They'd learned to use the facility's own systems as weapons against their creators. The explosions outside were getting much closer now, and I could feel the building shaking with each blast. The military was working their way through the downtown area systematically, destroying everything that might contain evidence of their experiment. I realized I needed to get out of the basement complex immediately, not just because of the enhanced infected, but because the entire area was about to be demolished. The parking garage might be my only chance to reach my truck and escape before the military destroyed the hospital. But the enhanced subjects had other plans. They'd positioned themselves throughout the tunnel system to prevent anyone from leaving. Not because they wanted to kill me necessarily, but because they needed witnesses. They wanted someone to survive long enough to tell the world what had been done to them. The leader approached me again, moving with that deliberate, calculating gait. It gestured toward the computer screen, pointing at specific data files. It was trying to communicate, trying to make me understand something important about the research. I followed its indication and read the files it had highlighted. These documents showed that the infection wasn't limited to Atlanta. There were similar facilities in other cities, other test sites where the same experiments were being conducted. Protocol 7 was much larger than just one hospital. The enhanced subject pointed to a map showing locations across the country: Birmingham, Nashville, Memphis, New Orleans. Dozens of cities where water supplies had been contaminated with the same agent that had been used. Here, the Atlanta outbreak was just one piece of a massive coordinated operation, but there was something else in the data that made my blood run cold. The infection wasn't random or accidental. It was targeted. The military had used population analysis and demographic data to choose specific communities for testing. They'd deliberately infected people based on factors like income level, education, and political affiliation. This wasn't just biological warfare, it was social engineering on a massive scale. They were using the infection to eliminate populations they considered undesirable, while gathering data on how to control and manipulate the survivors. The enhanced subject showed me another file, this one containing communication logs between different military units. They were reporting success rates, infection statistics, and containment effectiveness from multiple locations. The Atlanta test was considered highly successful, which meant they were planning to expand the program. I understood now why the enhanced infected were trying to communicate with me. They weren't just seeking revenge. They were trying to warn people about what was coming. They wanted someone to expose the truth about Protocol 7 before it was implemented on a larger scale. But the explosions were getting close enough that debris was starting to fall from the tunnel ceiling. The military demolition teams were almost at the hospital, and I was running out of time to escape. The enhanced subjects seemed to understand this too, because they started moving toward the tunnel exits with increasing urgency. The leader made a series of gestures that I interpreted as directions toward the parking garage. It was showing me a route through the tunnel system that would avoid the areas being bombed. But it was also indicating that I needed to move immediately, before the demolition reached the basement levels. I started following the route it had shown me, but the enhanced subjects followed along, moving parallel to my path through adjacent tunnels. They weren't hunting me anymore. They were escorting me, making sure I reached safety so I could tell others about what I'd discovered. The tunnel led to a maintenance area near the hospital's loading dock. From there, I could access the parking structure through a service corridor that connected the two buildings. But as I reached the access point, I heard something that made me pause. Human voices. Military personnel conducting a final sweep of the building before the demolition. They were checking each level systematically, making sure no evidence or witnesses remained. If they found me, I wouldn't survive long enough to tell anyone about Protocol 7. The enhanced subjects seemed to understand the danger too. They positioned themselves between me and the military search teams, ready to attack anyone who tried to prevent my escape. They were willing to sacrifice themselves to protect the evidence I was carrying. I could hear the search teams getting closer, their radio chatter growing louder as they worked their way through the building. They were reporting negative contacts, indicating that they'd found no survivors or evidence that needed to be eliminated. But they hadn't reached the basement levels yet. The leader of the enhanced subjects approached me one final time. It handed me a data storage device that it had taken from one of the research stations. The device contained complete documentation of the experiments, including video evidence of the transformation process and communication logs with military commanders. It gestured toward the parking garage entrance, indicating that I needed to go immediately. Then it made a sound that wasn't quite human, but carried an emotional weight that I recognized. It was saying goodbye. These creatures knew they weren't going to survive the demolition, but they wanted to make sure the truth about their creation would. I took the data device and started toward the parking garage, but I could hear the enhanced subjects moving in the opposite direction. They were going to confront the military search teams, buying me time to escape even though it meant certain death for them. As I reached the parking structure, I could hear fighting breaking out behind me. Not the sounds of mindless infected attacking humans, but coordinated combat between intelligent adversaries. The enhanced subjects were using tactics and strategy against the military teams, making them pay a heavy price for every level they cleared. But the explosions were getting much closer now, and I could see my truck in the distance. The parking garage was partially flooded, just as I'd expected from the basement research data. The water was about 3 feet deep throughout most of the lower level, but my truck was parked on a slightly elevated section that was still accessible. The flooding was a blessing. Turns out the regular infected people couldn't swim effectively, and most of them had avoided the parking garage entirely. But as I waded through the water toward my truck, I realized I wasn't alone down here. There were other things in the water. Not enhanced subjects like the ones I'd encountered in the basement, but something else. The research files had mentioned secondary mutations, subjects that had adapted to aquatic environments. These weren't regular zombies that had fallen in the water. They'd evolved specifically to hunt in flooded areas. Remember those documents I found? They mentioned secondary mutations. Now I knew what that meant. These waterlogged infected moved differently, with a sinuous, swimming motion that was eerily efficient. Their skin had become more translucent, and they seemed to have developed gills or some other adaptation for underwater breathing. I moved as quickly as possible through the water, trying to reach my truck before these aquatic predators could intercept me. But they were fast in their element, much faster than I could move while wading through 3 feet of contaminated water. One of them surfaced near me, and I got a close look at what the infection could do when it had time to fully adapt to environmental conditions. Its fingers had become webbed, its limbs elongated for swimming, and its eyes had developed a reflective quality that suggested enhanced underwater vision. But like the enhanced subjects in the basement, this creature retained enough intelligence to be strategic. It didn't attack immediately. Instead, it circled around me, testing my reactions and looking for weaknesses. These things weren't just adapted for aquatic hunting. They were smart enough to plan their attacks. I reached my truck just as more of them started surfacing around me. My keys were still in my pocket, and the truck's electrical system should still be functional since it had been parked above the flood level. But I needed to get the engine started before these aquatic predators decided to attack. The truck turned over on the first try, and I'd never been happier to hear an engine start. But as I put it in reverse to back out of the parking space, I saw something that made my heart sink. The garage exit was blocked by debris from the explosions, and the water level was rising as more of the city's storm drain system backed up into the basement. I was trapped in the parking garage with an unknown number of aquatic predators. The water level was rising, and the military demolition was getting close enough that the entire structure might collapse at any moment. But then I remembered something from my years as a mechanic. My truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a mobile workshop with everything I needed to modify it for emergency situations. I had welding equipment, cutting tools, and enough spare parts to turn it into something that could break through the debris blocking the exit. I started the modifications while the aquatic infected circled my truck like sharks. They seemed to understand that I was preparing to escape, and they were positioning themselves to attack as soon as I left the relative safety of the vehicle. The explosions were close enough now that I could see flashes of light through the garage entrance. Whatever the military was using, it was powerful enough to level entire city blocks. The hospital would be destroyed within minutes, and anyone still inside would be eliminated along with all evidence of Protocol 7. But I had the data storage device the enhanced subject had given me. I had the research files I'd downloaded, and I had witnessed firsthand what the military had done to the people of Atlanta. Even if I was the only survivor, at least the truth about this atrocity would survive with me. I finished the modifications to my truck and prepared to ram through the debris blocking the exit. The aquatic infected seemed to sense my intention because they started moving more aggressively, surrounding the truck and preparing to attack. This was my only chance to escape. If the truck got stuck in the debris, or if the aquatic predators managed to disable it, I would die in this flooded garage along with all the evidence of what had really happened in Atlanta. The engine roared as I floored the accelerator and aimed directly at the weakest point in the debris pile. Behind me, I could see the aquatic infected launching themselves out of the water, trying to reach the truck before it could break through to freedom. Everything I'd learned as a mechanic, every tool in my truck, every modification I'd ever made, it all came down to this moment. Either I would break through and escape to tell the world about Protocol 7, or I would become another casualty of the military's cover-up operation. The truck hit the debris pile with tremendous force, and for a moment I wasn't sure if it would be enough. But then I felt the barrier giving way, and suddenly I was bursting through into the open air outside the hospital. Behind me, the building exploded in a massive fireball that lit up the entire downtown area. The military had completed their demolition, destroying all physical evidence of their experiment. But they hadn't counted on one survivor escaping with proof of what they'd done. As I drove away from the destruction, I could see the true scope of what they were covering up. The entire downtown area was being systematically destroyed block by block, as if the demolition was designed to eliminate every trace of the outbreak. But I was alive, I had the evidence, and I was going to make sure the world learned the truth about Protocol 7 and what the military had done to the people of Atlanta. The only question now was whether I could stay alive long enough to get that evidence to people who could expose the conspiracy before they implemented the same program in other cities across the country. The truck burst through the debris pile with a grinding crash of metal against concrete, and suddenly I was outside the hospital for the first time in 3 days. The fresh air hit me like a physical blow after the stale, contaminated atmosphere I'd been breathing in the basement levels. But what I saw in front of me was worse than anything I'd encountered inside the building. Atlanta was dead. Not just damaged or evacuated, but completely destroyed. The entire downtown area looked like a war zone, with buildings reduced to smoking, rubble and streets cratered by explosions. The military hadn't just been covering up their experiment, they'd been systematically erasing an entire section of the city. I drove through streets that I'd known for years, but they were unrecognizable. Now, the office building where Mrs. Chen worked was nothing but twisted metal and concrete. The diner where I'd eaten lunch just 4 days ago was a smoking crater. Whole city blocks had been leveled so completely that you couldn't tell what had been there before. But the most disturbing thing was the silence. No sirens, no emergency vehicles, no rescue operations. Just the distant rumble of military aircraft and the occasional explosion as they continued their demolition work. They weren't trying to save anyone. They were making sure no one survived to talk about what had happened. My truck's CB radio crackled to life as I drove, picking up military communications that they probably thought were secure. Radio chatter between demolition teams, progress reports on the destruction, and confirmation that the contamination zone was being effectively sterilized. That's when I heard something that made my blood freeze. They weren't just destroying Atlanta. The radio chatter mentioned similar operations in Birmingham, Nashville, and Memphis. The cities I'd seen on the map in the basement research facility. Protocol 7 was being implemented simultaneously across multiple locations. The data storage device the enhanced subject had given me suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I wasn't just carrying evidence of what had happened in Atlanta. I was carrying proof of a coordinated attack on American citizens by their own military, mass murder disguised as disease control. I needed to get this information to someone who could expose it. But every radio station I tried was either off the air or broadcasting emergency messages, telling people to stay in their homes and await military assistance. The government had control of all official communication channels. As I drove through the devastated city, I started seeing the scope of their cover story. Emergency broadcasts were blaming the destruction on a terrorist attack using biological weapons. They were claiming that the military response was necessary to prevent the spread of an engineered plague. The story was believable enough that most people would accept it without question. A foreign terrorist organization had supposedly contaminated the water supply with an experimental bioweapon, forcing the military to implement emergency containment protocols. The mass casualties were being attributed to the bioweapon itself, not to the military's response. But I had evidence that proved it was all lies. The research files showed that Protocol 7 had been planned for months before the outbreak. The contamination was deliberate, the infections were intentional, and the military response was designed to eliminate witnesses rather than save lives. I reached the outskirts of the destruction zone and found military checkpoints blocking all the major roads. Soldiers in full hazmat gear were turning back anyone trying to enter or leave the area. According to their official story, they were preventing contamination from spreading to other cities. I couldn't risk going through an official checkpoint with the evidence I was carrying, so I used my knowledge of the local area to find back roads and service routes that might not be monitored. As a mechanic who had worked throughout the Atlanta area, I knew industrial access roads and utility corridors that most people never noticed. But even on the back roads, I encountered signs of the military operation. Helicopters flying search patterns, convoys of military vehicles, and reconnaissance drones that seemed to be mapping every possible escape route from the destruction zone. They were being thorough. Whatever Protocol 7 really involved, they couldn't afford to have any witnesses survive to contradict their official story. That meant anyone who had been in the contamination zone during the outbreak was considered a security risk that needed to be eliminated. I found a rural route that seemed to be unmonitored and started driving toward Birmingham. If the radio chatter was accurate, that city was experiencing its own outbreak, which meant their water supply had been contaminated according to the same timeline I'd seen in the research data. But Birmingham's water supply had been compromised too. Just like Dr. Martinez had warned in those final hours before the pediatric ward was overrun, the infection pattern was being replicated across multiple cities, each one serving as a test site for different aspects of the bioweapon program. As I drove through the Georgia countryside, I started picking up radio broadcasts from other areas. Reports of illness outbreaks in Birmingham and Nashville, emergency declarations, and the familiar pattern of military intervention that I'd witnessed in Atlanta. But there were also other voices on the emergency frequencies: ham radio operators, independent journalists, and ordinary citizens who were reporting things that contradicted the official story. People who had seen military vehicles in their areas before the outbreak started. Witnesses who had noticed unusual activity around water treatment facilities. I realized I wasn't the only survivor who suspected the truth about what was happening. There were people throughout the affected regions who had pieces of the puzzle, fragments of evidence that proved the outbreaks weren't natural or terrorist-related. I tried to make contact with some of these voices, but my truck's CB radio didn't have the range or capabilities needed for long-distance communication. I needed to find a more powerful transmitter, someplace where I could upload the research data and broadcast it widely enough that the truth couldn't be suppressed. I remembered a friend from my Detroit days who had moved to a small town about 2 hours north of Atlanta. Jimmy ran an independent radio station that served the rural communities in that area. He was exactly the kind of person who would help expose a government conspiracy, and his transmitter had enough power to reach multiple states. But as I drove toward Jimmy's location, I started noticing signs that I was being followed. Military vehicles that appeared in my mirrors periodically, aircraft that seemed to be tracking my route, and the occasional roadblock that forced me to change direction. They knew someone had escaped from the Atlanta destruction zone, and they were conducting a systematic search to find me. The military had resources I couldn't match, and they were slowly tightening a net around the entire region. I reached Jimmy's town just as the sun was setting, but something was wrong. The main street was deserted, and several buildings showed signs of recent damage. Not the massive destruction I'd seen in Atlanta, but targeted strikes that suggested military action. I found Jimmy's radio station, but the building was dark and the transmitter tower had been destroyed. Someone had cut the guy wires with explosives, bringing the entire structure down in a way that would prevent any broadcasting. This wasn't accidental damage. It was deliberate sabotage. I checked Jimmy's house and found evidence of a struggle. Furniture overturned, doors broken, and signs that someone had been forcibly removed. The military had gotten here ahead of me, eliminating anyone who might have the capability to broadcast information they didn't want released. But Jimmy was smart, and he'd always been paranoid about government surveillance. I knew he had backup equipment hidden at different locations around town, emergency transmitters that he could use if his main station was ever compromised. I found one of his backup sites in an old barn outside town. The equipment was still there, hidden under farm machinery and agricultural supplies. It wasn't as powerful as his main transmitter, but it was enough to reach other independent broadcasters who might be able to relay information further. I spent the next hour uploading the research data from the storage device to multiple servers and broadcast networks. Everything the enhanced subject had given me, all the files I'd downloaded from the basement facility, the complete documentation of Protocol 7 and the military's role in creating the outbreak. But as I was finishing the upload, I heard vehicles approaching the barn, military trucks moving fast and directly toward my location. They'd been tracking my radio transmissions, and they'd found me. I grabbed the most critical files and ran for my truck, but I could see soldiers deploying around the building. They had me surrounded, and there was no way to escape without fighting through a trained military unit. That's when I realized something that changed everything. These weren't regular soldiers. They were wearing the same hazmat gear I'd seen at the checkpoints, but their movement patterns and tactics were different. They moved too precisely, too coordinated, like they were following programming rather than training. These soldiers had been infected too. Not with the same strain that had affected the civilians in Atlanta, but with something else. Something that enhanced their physical capabilities while maintaining their military discipline and training. The military hadn't just been experimenting on civilian populations. They'd been developing enhanced soldiers, creating super soldiers who combined human intelligence with improved physical performance and absolute obedience to orders. I watched them surround the barn with perfect coordination, each soldier knowing exactly where to position themselves for maximum tactical advantage. They weren't just following orders. They were executing a program that had been implanted in their minds along with their physical enhancements. But I had one advantage they didn't expect. As a mechanic, I'd modified my truck for exactly this kind of situation. Reinforced bumpers, upgraded engine, and armor plating that would stop small arms fire. It wasn't military-grade equipment, but it was enough to punch through their containment. I started the engine and aimed for the weakest point in their perimeter. The enhanced soldiers reacted immediately, but their movements were too predictable. They followed tactical protocols that I could anticipate because they'd been programmed rather than trained. The truck smashed through their formation and out into the open countryside. Behind me, I could hear them reorganizing for pursuit, but their vehicles weren't designed for off-road chasing. My truck had the advantage on rough terrain. As I drove through the darkness, I kept thinking about what I'd learned. Protocol 7 wasn't just about testing bioweapons on civilian populations. It was about creating enhanced humans for military use. The infected civilians were test subjects, but the real goal was developing super soldiers who could be controlled absolutely. The radio transmissions had worked. I started hearing reports from other areas about military units that were acting strangely. Soldiers who seemed to have unusual capabilities but followed orders with mechanical precision. People were beginning to notice that something was wrong with the official response to the outbreaks. But I also heard reports that made my heart sink. Birmingham was experiencing the same pattern of destruction that had hit Atlanta. Military forces were implementing containment protocols that involved leveling entire sections of the city. The jets I'd been hearing weren't rescue missions. They were cleanup crews, eliminating evidence and witnesses just like they'd done in Atlanta. Nashville and Memphis were next on the list, and after that, the program would probably expand to even more cities. I realized I needed to do more than just expose the truth about Protocol 7. I needed to find other survivors who could help fight back against this program before it spread to the entire country. The research data had included information about resistance to the infection. Some people had genetic markers that made them immune to the bioweapon, while others developed natural antibodies that prevented transformation. These immune individuals were scattered throughout the affected areas, but they could form the core of a resistance movement. I started broadcasting on emergency frequencies, trying to make contact with other survivors who might be willing to fight back. It was dangerous because the military was monitoring all communications, but it was the only way to organize any kind of effective response. The responses I got were encouraging. There were people throughout the region who had survived the initial outbreaks and were suspicious about the official story. Some had evidence of their own. Others had witnessed things that contradicted the government's narrative. But there were also reports of military teams conducting house-to-house searches in areas that hadn't been officially affected by the outbreaks. They were looking for survivors, people who might have been exposed, but didn't show symptoms of infection. These immune individuals were being rounded up and taken to undisclosed locations. According to the research data, they were valuable test subjects for developing countermeasures and improving the bioweapon's effectiveness. I realized that my own survival made me a target. I'd been exposed to the infection but hadn't transformed, which meant I had natural immunity that the military would want to study. Every moment I remained free was putting me at greater risk of capture. But I also realized that my immunity might be the key to stopping Protocol 7. If I could find other immune survivors and organize them into a resistance network, we might be able to gather enough evidence and testimony to expose the truth on a scale that couldn't be suppressed. The data storage device contained contact information for other research facilities involved in the program. Sites in Texas, California, and the Northeast, where similar experiments were being conducted. If we could coordinate attacks on multiple facilities simultaneously, We might be able to gather enough evidence to prove the scope of the conspiracy. I spent the rest of that night driving toward a safe house that one of the ham radio operators had told me about, a place where immune survivors were gathering to plan their next moves. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As I drove through the pre-dawn darkness, I kept thinking about the enhanced subject that had saved my life by giving me the research data. It had sacrificed itself to make sure the truth would survive, even though it knew that truth wouldn't bring back its humanity. Those creatures had been people once, ordinary citizens who had been deliberately infected by their own government, transformed into monsters for the sake of a military experiment, and then abandoned when the program moved to its next phase. They deserved justice. Everyone who had died in Atlanta, Birmingham, Nashville, and Memphis deserved justice, and the only way they were going to get it was if people like me survived long enough to tell their stories. If you're listening to this, don't trust the military checkpoints. Don't trust the official stories about terrorist attacks or foreign bioweapons. And whatever you do, don't drink the water in any major city until you're absolutely certain it hasn't been contaminated, the infection isn't random, and it isn't accidental. It's a weapon being used against American citizens by their own government. Protocol 7 is still active, still expanding, and the people responsible are still in positions of power. Stay alive, stay smart, and remember that in this new world, the most dangerous enemy isn't always the one with black eyes and bloody teeth. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one wearing a uniform and claiming to be there to help you. Find other survivors, gather evidence, and don't let them bury the truth along with the bodies. The people who died in those cities are counting on us to make sure their deaths weren't meaningless. This isn't over. This is just the beginning. And if we don't stop them now, Protocol 7 will spread until there's no one left to remember what freedom actually looked like. The data is out there now, scattered across multiple networks and servers where it can't be completely destroyed. Other people have copies, other survivors are spreading the word, and eventually the truth will reach enough people that it can't be suppressed anymore. But until then, we have to survive. We have to keep fighting. And we have to make sure that the next time someone tries to tell you that the government is here to help, you remember what really happened in Atlanta during those first 72 hours of the outbreak. Because those 72 hours weren't the end of civilization. They were the beginning of something much worse. And the only way to stop it is to make sure everyone knows the truth about what our own government is willing to do to its own people in the name of national security.